Chair Van Brocklin, we are now live.
Okay. Thank you, Wayne, very much. So I'm going to wait until I have 11:58, so I'm going to wait for 2 minutes here. I think we have Chris Strickler in the attendees category. Maybe we want to move him to the panelists. Thank you. Okay, we'll begin here in just another minute. Okay, we're going to get started here. Welcome everyone to the March 30th special meeting of the Oregon Transportation Commission. Today's meeting is focused on the flexible funding and the new infrastructure bill, federal infrastructure bill. And we will have a discussion, a presentation by staff, followed by a discussion by the commission, followed by a decision by the commission on the flexible funding allocations. We'll also have an update for, on the bridge funding, which is part of that same federal act. Before turning it over to staff for their report, I'd just like to say that thank you to a number of people. So first, thank you to the Oregon Congressional Delegation and its staff for all of the work it did in the course of the development and passage of this substantial new infrastructure funding bill by the Congress and signed into law by the president. So first and foremost, thank you to our delegation, to the federal, to the Congress and to the president for bringing this to fruition for all of us. And the funding that Oregon will receive is significant and important. Second, I'd like to thank all of those who participated in our process of hearing people's views on the flexible funding and to some extent the bill itself in its entirety. We heard from both in direct oral testimony and in written comments from many, many people across the state, from the governor and members of the legislature to local elected officials, or organizations from around the state, and many individuals. So I want to thank all of those who have participated. Your participation is important and we appreciate your involvement. Third, I'd like to thank our staff for all of the work they've done to allow us to understand the bill and to answer our questions and help us think through the work that we're charged with doing related to the bill. And finally, before turning it over to the panel of staff members we have today, I'd like to note that there are clearly disagreements about how to prioritize these funds from those who participated, and I'm sure from those who didn't, about how they would prioritize these decisions and where they would allocate the funding. And I think those differences are fair. We did receive or will receive over the next 5 or 6 years a substantial amount of money. This is a large amount of money, roughly $1.2 billion over 6 years. But the need is even larger. And so that scarcity in funding to solve all problems or address even partially all problems is simply not there. So we're faced with having to make choices, and with that comes disagreement in terms of prioritization. I would just say with respect to that, and I think I speak for everyone on the commission and everyone in the agency, we see all of the arguments. We have to make hard decisions, and we're trying to balance a lot of important interests. So we recognize that people can disagree, and that's part of a democratic process. And so we appreciate, again, the comments and the participation, and we're trying to be as thoughtful as we can be about this. So with that, I will turn it over to the panel of staff members that we have to walk us through kind of where we stand off of our last conversation about this at our meeting earlier in the month. And those are Assistant Director Brower, Assistant Director Cooper Brown, Administrator Peets, Administrator Lind, and Administrator Criswell. I think I have them all. So I guess I'll turn it over to Travis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the commission. For the record, I'm Travis Brower, ODOT's Assistant Director for Revenue Finance Compliance. As the chair noted, you were here a mere 20 days ago, not even 3 weeks ago, for your last meeting. And we had a number of pieces of direction that we had where the commission deliberated to a pretty good consensus. And if Sabrina or others could bring up the PowerPoint, I will start walking you through the direction for the day, what we heard and what we're bringing forward to you. Next slide, please. So we took a number of points from the March 10th meeting. I just wanted to remind you of those and reiterate what we heard and took from that day. So first, the commissioners supported the proposed allocations that ODOT brought forward for a variety of programs: ADA, local climate planning, match for competitive grants, and operations and maintenance. But one of the programs that we had sort of an off-the-top allocation, you wanted to provide additional funding for business and workforce development. We also heard from Commissioner Simpson in particular about developing a proposal for an innovative mobility pilot program focused on improving transportation options for people to get around without a car. You also asked us to bring back a hybrid scenario focused on public and active transportation and fix it. And Commissioners Smith and Brown provided some specific suggestions that we have then worked to synthesize into a single proposal. Chair Van Brocklin in particular, as well as others, discussed the need to develop a proposal to supplement the federal electric vehicle formula funding with additional resources from other parts of the IIJA and within ODOT's budget. And then last, you asked us to develop a plan to aggressively pursue federal competitive grant funding. So today we are bringing you back a proposal that is responsive to those. We're going to walk through the first 5 of these essentially, and then leave the discussion about competitive grant funding for a later date. So next slide, please. What we're going to specifically walk through today is Ms. Peets is going to talk about electric vehicle infrastructure funding and how we can provide additional resources on top of the specific national electric vehicle infrastructure grants that we're going to get from USDOT. We are then going to have a shift into the discussion about the federal flexible funds, starting with a conversation from Ms. Criswell about the Innovative Mobility Pilot Program. And then we will bring to you the hybrid scenario that we heard from the last discussion as a starting point for you then to discuss, make any amendments, and then approve the federal highway flexible funding allocation, including funding for the Innovative Mobility Pilot Program. Last, Mr. Lind will give you an overview of the allocation proposal for bridge funding. And then I'll give you a sense of what the next steps are for the IIJA, because as much as you would like to be done today, you still have some work to do, although this is going to be the biggest decision by far. So with that, go to the next slide, please. And I will turn it over to Amanda to walk through our proposal for increasing funding for electric vehicle infrastructure.
Great. Thanks, Travis. For the record, my name is Amanda Peets. I'm the administrator for the Policy Data and Analysis Division at ODOT, and I'm joining you today from Vancouver, BC, where I'm just about to get on an international panel and speak about this very topic. So I guess a lot of interest in this topic worldwide, certainly. So as we talk about transportation electrification, it's not just about cars and trucks, it's also about the medium and heavy duty freight vehicles, electric buses, as well as e-micromobility, so electric bikes and electric scooters. And as we move forward and try to electrify the transportation system, we recognize that there's some key barriers and opportunities that we need to address. And those are the four here shown in the center of the screen. So infrastructure, the charging infrastructure itself, so people can plug in and travel, the cost, particularly the cost of the vehicles, and making sure that's accessible. And then lastly, awareness, and that people know what options are available to them, how to travel, all those kinds of things. Of course, center to all those efforts is equity and making sure that charging infrastructure and vehicles are accessible to all, and really centering equity and all that work. There's a number of different entities that play a role in transportation electrification in the state. ODOT is very centered to that role. We really play a convening role across state agencies at the direction of the governor's office. We convene and bring people together, talk about how to address these four barriers and make sure that things are interconnected. I think often when people hear about some of these electrification efforts, they think they're disparate and disconnected, and that's not the case. We work really hard to make sure that the pieces fit together and interlock to form that bigger picture. We have other agencies like DEQ that primarily plays a role in that cost category that I mentioned earlier, where they have rebates and incentives for vehicles, including for low-income individuals as well. And then Department of Energy really plays in that awareness space where they have a lot of data and information that's provided to the public and that makes electrification more accessible. Then you have the Public Utility Commission and utilities in general, which play an enormous role in all of this, making sure that the infrastructure there is functional, making sure that power is coming to the sites to provide that, and their service providers themselves. And of course, the private sector. So all this work is very interconnected. We play a key role in bringing everybody together and convening that. And our other key role is really around the infrastructure, the charging infrastructure. We're the lead agency across all those different types of transportation electrification that leads that infrastructure conversation. Next slide, please. And speaking of infrastructure, and as Travis mentioned, we're all in. We're ready to make a pretty substantial investment in transportation electrification and charging infrastructure. So we have, in addition to the $52 million that's coming from the Infrastructure Investments and Jobs Act, found funding from additional sources to have a dedicated over $100 million for charging infrastructure. So a pretty substantial investment. So thanks to the leadership of Chair Van Brockman and others, we've really tried to identify those ways to make a bold and transformative investment in this space. Some may ask why. Why is this the area where we're putting a fair amount of money? Well, there's a lot of key drivers, one of which is our statewide transportation strategy for greenhouse gas reduction. So from the climate change front, one of the most significant things that we can do is make every single mile driven clean. And so you'll see on those bars to the right that about 50% of what we need to do to reach our climate goals is to transition to cleaner vehicles and fuels. So this is an essential area where we need to invest. I will acknowledge, though, it's not the only thing that we're doing. You know, we need to invest more in low and no emission modes like biking, walking, public transportation, as well as pricing the transportation system. So there's a lot of things that fit together. I've mentioned the Transportation Electrification Infrastructure Needs Analysis, or TINA, a couple times with you all. And that's really key in helping us understand where do we need to get to in the future to achieve the electrification goals that we want. And just within the next 5 years, we need a 5-time increase in the amount of charging infrastructure out there. This will be a substantial step forward towards achieving that increase. And then the last thing I would mention is that the time is now. We see the market really transitioning towards more manufacturers making electric vehicles. We see the demand high enough where sometimes the market's not keeping pace with the demand that's out there. And additionally, we really have the opportunity to propel the market because if we put the charging infrastructure out there and people start to see it on the day-to-day trips that they make, then it helps to reduce that range anxiety that a lot of people have. And then more people are willing to buy electric vehicles and enter into that market. So the timing is really key on this too. Next slide. So what does this amount of money buy us? It buys us a fair amount. So I'll give you a few illustrative examples. One of which is with a $100 million investment, we can build the backbone system for charging across the state. So those are the gray lines on the map there, and that's what I shared last time. Those are our current federally designated alternative fuel corridors. The blue lines on the map are additional corridors we will likely propose over the next 5 years and can likely build out as well. And then in addition to that, and as I mentioned, equity being centered to the work that we do, our focus will really particularly be on adding charging infrastructure around multi-unit dwellings to low-income neighborhoods and to some of our rural parts of the state, so we can make some substantial steps forward there. And then lastly, and importantly, as I mentioned, it really helps to address our climate goals. And the sooner that we do that, the faster we can get back on that trajectory and hopefully still achieve what we need to achieve. So pretty critical there. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions, or Chairman Brockman, I don't know if you'd like to make any remarks before moving on to the next part of the presentation.
Well, I guess I'd ask commission members for questions first, and then I'll go last if there are any questions at this point. And there'll also be an opportunity at the end of the overall presentation if you're still formulating questions. So is there anyone on the commission who would like to make a comment or question, pose a question? I would only just say that I think this is critical. My understanding is that the roughly 52 million we have from the IIJA is restricted to approved federal corridors, highway corridors that's really focused on travel between communities and range anxiety, as you mentioned, Amanda. I think matching that with a similar amount from the state that gets us above $100 million is important in terms of the other things you're talking about, and the charging accessibility that we need that is not on the state system, so that we can round out, because I assume not all 16,926 charging stations to get to 5x of where we are now is going to be on the state system. Some of it, a bunch of it, is going to be in localities. So I think we have to step up to the entire program in order for it to work. And the one thing I've said before that I think is very important is that we stay ahead of the curve on this. And auto manufacturers are clearly moving to transform to electric, and we can't be behind that curve. My understanding is we're one of the 2 or 3 states that is leading on transition from gas-powered vehicles to electric. I think there are reports out there that put us 2nd or 3rd behind California, maybe one other state. So this is already happening in Oregon, and we're going to be a leading adopter and an early adopter. So I don't want the infrastructure to be behind the transition by individual automobile owners to electric, which if people want to make that change, we need to facilitate through this infrastructure their ability to do it and be able to operate electric versus internal combustion engine vehicles. So I'm a big proponent of this, as you can tell. So that's really more a comment than a question. If there are no questions at this point, I guess we move on. And thank you, Amanda, for your presentation.
All right. I will take the reins again then. For the record again, Travis Brower, Assistant Director, and we are going to now move into talking about the flexible highway funding. You have now heard from literally thousands of Oregonians about what they would like to see to maximize the investments from these funds. And we will now ask you for a decision about that. We're going to start off by having Karen Criswell talk about the Innovative Mobility Pilot Program, which Commissioner Simpson proposed earlier this month. We've been working a little bit offline with him and others to define and refine this concept. Today, what we will like to do is get a decision from you on how much funding to provide. We've proposed $5 million in federal funds through IIJA and $5 million in state funds from our Transportation Operating Fund. But we also want your feedback on this outline that Karen will present so that we can come back in May with a final proposal based on the funding level you provided, and we can have you give the thumbs up to that. So Karen, take it away.
Thank you, Travis. Karen Criswell, Public Transportation Division Administrator. Good afternoon, Chair Van Brocklin and Commissioners. So as Travis mentioned earlier, Vice Chair Simpson had proposed previously an innovative mobility pilot program. And what we are proposing for your consideration today is a 3-year pilot that would provide grants to community-based organizations and government agencies for innovative public and active transportation programs and projects that are really focused on enhancing sustainable and equitable mobility. This program would really complement and extremely significantly expand the scope and funding of ODOT's current transportation options program, which the commission had awarded $5.5 million in the 21-24 STIP. And for this program, we're proposing a mix of federal, IIJA, as well as state funds in order to make the program more accessible to community organizations run by and for the benefit of historically excluded groups. The reporting requirements, as I think most of you know, on federal funding can really place an undue burden on small organizations, but by also including the state funds, we can lower those barriers to participation. As currently conceived, and you see a range on there, we're proposing that approximately half of the funding would be accessed through competitive discretionary grants, with a minimum amount of that set to be part of a ongoing rolling innovative grant fund that could be accessed at any time, and then the remainder of that being accessible through an annual solicitation cycle. The remaining 50% would be expended via targeted ODOT convened and ODOT delivered and partner delivered programs. Next slide, please. So the program would include funding for projects all across Oregon, as well as some funding targeted to mitigate congestion pricing in the Portland metro area. The program approach goals include things like collaborating with marginalized groups and organizations that serve these communities to develop and deliver innovative multimodal transportation efforts and projects. We also want to help those community-based organizations to build further capacity to both successfully apply for and to be able to deliver these transportation options programs and services that the communities so deeply need. Just a few ideas of potential projects as a starting point. Travel training and encouragement programs to help people get experience and confidence using alternative forms of transportation. Bike safety gear, skills training, bike racks, all of those help to reduce barriers for cycling for day-to-day travel. Expansion of both urban as well as the addition of rural van pools. This would provide more affordable and low emission commuting and job access options. One that I'm particularly excited about is the potential for an interoperable pedal as well as an electric bike share program, so people can travel using transit or rail from one part of the state to another and use the bike share to complete their journeys, or for shorter trips around town, and expanding the reach of those around town trips that don't involve getting in a car. These are, of course, just a few of our initial ideas. And one of the first pieces of work for this program will be to assess the needs on the ground and build ODOT's capacity to work with community groups. So regardless of what the final projects are, the Innovative Mobility Program will help us to move towards a model where ODOT really works far more closer in collaboration with the community than I think we have done historically. I think that's one of the things that's the most exciting about the program. And so with that, I will pause and see if there's any questions or comments, additions.
I guess I'd call on Vice Chair Simpson if he has remarks you'd like to make as the kind of the initiator of this idea, which is a very exciting idea.
Yeah, nothing really at this point, but I just wanted to echo all those comments that Karen very articulately expressed earlier. I think it's, to me personally, I think there's a great opportunity right now for the agency to really step up and have a more intimate relationship with not only community organizations, but individuals that those organizations represent. I think as agencies have been kind of hidden from on the ground. It's a lot easier and in a lot of ways statutorily required for us to pass resources through other public agencies who do that and have those intimate relationships. But I think it's time and necessary for the agency ODOT to start building those genuine, authentic relationships. And so I'm personally just inspired to see that there can be an opportunity for something to evolve into something we couldn't even imagine. And that's where I think the greatest opportunity lies, is because the community, the people are going to know what the highest needs are going to be for themselves as well as future generations as it pertains to mobility and alternative forms of mobility outside of the highway system, which is what obviously this agency was founded on. So more work to come, I would assume, but this is obviously a great start, great gesture, and I'm going to leave it open for the others because I see hands raised.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Other comments or questions from the commissioners?
Mr. Chair.
Commissioner Smith.
Thank you. I just wanted to also echo Commissioner Simpson's comments that this is a great, innovative pilot program. I think trying some different way to engage on the ground is really important. And it is very consistent with what I've been hearing from the Equity and Mobility Advisory Committee for tolling, which I participate in as the commissioner representative. And we've heard very clearly from that group who are in the community in the metro area that there's a desire to have this type of work even in advance of the actual tolling. And so having some funds available to do this innovative work and work with the people in the community on what they need, I think is critical. And so it really partly fills that request to accommodate pre-tolling mitigations, so to speak. And so I think it's great. I'm also excited that it could be a pilot that, we incubate and try across the state. So I think it's great. And thanks to Orlando for suggesting it.
Thank you. I want to also weigh in on this and recognize Orlando's leadership on this, which I think is really inspired and important for all the reasons he has said and Sharon has said. So I appreciate his leadership, one. Two, I do think it's responsive in the way that Commissioner Smith was referring to, not just on tolling, but potentially more broadly and potentially beyond the Portland region. I think it also allows us to establish direct relationships, and Orlando's comment about, because a lot of our funding at the local level is seen as being city and county funding, but it actually originates with the state gas tax and other state funding, so that we pass through, and that's a good system. But after we've passed it through, we kind of disappear but we're actually a party to it. So I think our commitment to local government through sharing of resources, and we're one of the most generous states in the country in terms of the split state, county, and city on funding, is it's very, very important for us to have some direct relationships, or else we don't have the working arrangements in place to actually deal with an issue when it comes up. So I think all of that is very positive. And so I congratulate Orlando, and I appreciate Commissioner Smith leaning in on this as well. So thank you both. Are there other comments or questions from the commission members?
Yes.
I'm not seeing the
Chairman
hands up
Brockman.
here is the problem, because I have these other things on my screen. So apologies for not seeing the hands raised. Marceline,
No worries. Good afternoon, everyone.
good afternoon.
I would like to echo the chair's thanks to Vice Chair Simpson, Commissioner Smith, and the staff for bringing this together. It was a very general idea, at least to my mind, at our last meeting. And so putting a little meat on these bones in it. This last slide in particular captures something that I have been thinking about as I thought about the City of Eugene's very small pilot program with respect to electric vehicles and placing those in the community. And to reflect on another commenter's words, they quoted a field of dreams. And they, if you build it, they will come. And of course, they were using it in a different context. But this is the thing: if you build it, they will come, maybe. And so to recognize that it takes more than just building, especially as we move away from some of our traditional modes of transportation. So I really do applaud the idea and the thinking through how we actually engage the citizens across different populations to actually make it more likely than not that people will choose differently in the future.
Thank you, Commissioner Brown. I'm now seeing hands.
Thank you, Chair. Of course, I'm going to comment on this because it's right in my wheelhouse and the things that we've tried to do at Rogue Valley Transportation District. I applaud everyone for their effort on this. And my biggest concern is the amount of money that we've put into it. On the top is statewide and targeted congestion pricing mitigation. And we've heard from the Portland metro area how important this is, but I don't want us to lose sight of some of the other urban areas and small urban areas that also are facing problems, because I think that Commissioner Burke said it well: if you build it, they may come. They're going to come. I mean, we're all facing this now at this point, especially with gas prices the way they are. People are really struggling, and they're having to look and be innovative. And so I think that though we're making a gesture with the amount of money we're setting aside, it may not be enough. And it may not be soon enough. But this is the choice that we're making, because there's so much that needs to be done. But to Administrator Criswell, thank you. And I know that you have advisory committees that will all weigh in on this, and I look forward to some of those conversations.
Thank you, Commissioner. And thank you, Commissioner Burke, as well. So very exciting. I think the point is this is new. We'll have to learn as we go. We have the good fortune of having Karen as our lead ODOT person on this. And so that is great and raises my level of confidence, but I'm sure we will find out things that we need to tweak or change. And we will also, I'm sure, find that over time, maybe over a short period of time, that we need additional funding. And then I really want to pick up on Commissioner Brown's comment and Commissioner Burke's that ultimately this is something that we need to think about in terms of a broader application around the state. So, the Salem's, Eugene's, Medford's, Bend, Pendleton's, et cetera, there will be opportunities as we continue to develop this. And among the many things I'm excited about is the relational value of this. I do think it gets us into a better communication vein with people we've been somewhat, just because of the way things are set up, we've been less able to connect with. We're not in these communities every day. And there are a number of communities we have no commissioner in, obviously, with only 5 members. And so we need to explore this. And so again, I want to particularly commend Commissioner Simpson for developing this and really thinking outside the box and trying to bring something new. And I think this is an exciting innovation. So I'll turn it back to Karen to see if there's anything else she'd like to say.
Nope, just that we will be back in front of you in May with yet a little bit more flesh on the bones to make sure that we've got the framework right. We'll be looking to the commission to approve the criteria for the funding programs. So you can expect to see us coming back and doing more work between now and then, and more really starting to engage with the community as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Karen.
And back to Travis.
Yes, back to Travis.
Thank you. I am going to now move into the next slide, which is the discussion of what I'm essentially calling the Consensus Hybrid Flexible Fund proposal. So you'll recall earlier this month that the commission had a good debate and discussion about the allocation of the flexible funds. And I would say we generally saw a fairly high level of consensus among commissioners. You all provided great feedback, and we took the proposals that were put on the table by Commissioner Smith and Commissioner Brown, which were very similar, and essentially worked in funding for the Innovative Mobility Pilot Program, as that was not part of that yet, and came up with this scenario, which per your direction focuses primarily on fix-it and public and active transportation. I would note that the bottom 5 programs in the slightly lighter blue color are the ones that were the same in all scenarios. And we have adjusted upward the business and workforce development to $7 million. On the top are the 5 programs that fall into the categories of fix-it, enhanced highway, and public and active transportation. And what we see here is that this scenario generally is a hybrid between the public and active transportation scenario and the fix-it scenario. So levels of funding for enhanced highway that are on the lower end, and higher funding for those other 2 categories. Next slide, please. You can see that a little bit better and more graphically here in this slide, which shows you on the left in gray scales, those 5 categories that were held constant in all the scenarios. About half of the funding goes into those. But then the rest of the funding is split between those 3 major categories. The largest single category of funding beyond ADA accessibility is $85 million for the 3 public and active transportation programs: Great Streets, Safe Routes to Schools, and Innovative Mobility. The second largest then is the Fix-It programs, which would supplement the money that's already in the STIP and that is in the IIJA to allow us to do work, particularly with pavement preservation, which was arguably underfunded in the last STIP. It actually took a little bit of a haircut from previous levels. We would also put some of this money into mitigating effects on the environment of some of our facilities that are related to the Portland Harbor, as well as into our operations program that deals with landslides and rock slides and some of the other areas of the system. Within the enhanced highway category, $50 million, which is the smallest of the 3 major categories, that is essentially sufficient to focus primarily on a couple of projects that were funded by HB 2017, but not fully funded for all phases. So we would look at the very least to focus on the US 97 Bend North Corridor project and the I-5 Aurora Donald interchange, both of which need some additional funding to move forward as a complete project. If we're able to complete those 2, then we would look at other projects all across the state, but we do not anticipate that there would be really any additional funding available. Next slide, please. What this slide shows is the total final funding allocation across all of the various IIJA programs, not just the flexible funds, but the dedicated funds as well. What you see is that the two largest areas in this are what I call sustainable and equitable transportation. That's everything from the climate focused programs to public transportation and bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure. The second largest is the Fix-It program, the other large program is the Fix-It program. So those two receive the bulk of the funding, with another wedge going into ADA accessibility, as well as a very small amount, 4% of the total going into enhanced highway. And then essentially everything else, including safety funding, some direct dedicated local funding, and others types of funds come up to 18%. Now, I should note that there's actually a much larger share of local funding than 18%, as there is local funding included in each of these other categories in general, particularly in Fix-It and sustainable and equitable transportation. Next slide, please. We use the model that we have to judge the outcomes of various of the investments in various areas to run this hybrid scenario through. And what you can see is that it is a very balanced set of outcomes. It has strong impacts on GHG mitigation, as that's a large focus of the spending is on public and active transportation. It also has some benefits in most of the other areas, with a little bit less in the area of safety and congestion relief. So it is a very balanced set of outcomes. I should also note that the difference between these scenarios are fairly small, in the sense that the amount of money that is shifted between these categories, between the different scenarios, is generally in the tens of millions of dollars, not hundreds of millions of dollars. And as a result, the difference between one green up arrow and two green up arrows is oftentimes fairly minor. What you can see, though, is if you look in the left column, you can see the pre-infrastructure bill letter grade that we gave ourselves of how we were doing in working to meet our existing goals. On the right, you can see how we're doing with all of these funds, including the dedicated funds in the IIJA. And so you see that in all these areas, we would have at least some increase from the infrastructure bill, and yet in none of them do we really get a stellar grade, and none of them do we improve markedly. And in some of them, we are still lagging quite a ways behind. So with that, I will wrap up, and we present this hybrid scenario to you really as a starting point for your discussion. It is one that you can modify. You could approve as is. You could go in an entirely different direction, but we hope that it will be a good starting point for discussion. And I might recommend that we go back to slide 11 and display that on the screen as we turn it over to the commission for discussion, as that shows the funding for all of these areas.
Questions for Travis before we talk through this list? I guess I have one question. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I don't know if you can see hands, so I didn't even put one up, Chair.
No, I didn't. I can't see hands now, so please go back to using hands.
Okay, I'll go back to good Zoom etiquette. Question, going back to the slide with the up arrows, because that's my favorite slide.
Yeah, that's the slide.
Are we missing an up arrow in the hybrid solution for safety? I think we said with this hybrid, we're going from a B to a B+.
Commissioner, I believe that most of the increase in safety outcomes under the IIJA would come from the additional funding that is directed into safety from the IIJA. There's additional money for our All Roads Transportation Safety Program, which provides money to cities and counties and ODOT to invest in those locations that have the documented instances of safety challenges, fatalities and serious injuries, and to use a very data-based approach to try to find the most effective locations to make those investments. So we would see an improvement there. I would tell you that any of these scenarios, any investment we make is designed at least in part to impact safety. So funding in any category would indeed have some impact on safety.
Okay, thank you. Back to you, Chair.
Okay, other questions? I had one of, which is on ADA. So important program, the result of a settlement agreement. Where are we on this program in terms of our likely overall commitment globally, how much we've spent or allocated at least, and how much is left? I'm just trying to get a sense of where we are, and I don't have a very good sense of where we are on ADA funding pursuant to the settlement. So if I could just get some big picture, this is $1 billion program. We've allocated 400 million. We've got 600 million to go. That's the kind of answer I'm looking for. Just a kind of orientation answer.
And the timeline of when that needs to be met.
Yeah, and the timeline. Good point.
Chair, if I may, this is Macklin, Interim Administrator for Delivery and Operations. I'll take that question. Apologies for not having the numbers right in front of me. The way I think about that answer is we don't have the totality of what the investment's going to take. Where we're at today, Commissioner Simpson, to your point, by the end of this calendar year, the first deliverable of that settlement agreement is for us to have completed 30% of the ramps that were non-compliant when we did the assessment. So there's about 28,000 ramps across the ODOT system that we committed to upgrade. By the end of this calendar year, we'll have to upgrade 7,700 of those. That's 30%. The next milestone is 50% more. So we'll be at 75%. And we have 15 years in total. So we've got another 10 years of the ADA settlement agreement to complete the construction of all 27,000 curb ramps. Today, that's the number I don't have in front of me at the moment in terms of how much we've invested in that program. It is continuing to increase, as the commission well knows, especially much of the dialogue we had putting this on the scenario proposal to begin with. And we're seeing bids continue to come in higher. We've had some conversations around the Continuous Improvement Advisory Committee, as well as with the commission in the past around just what we're seeing in the marketplace, as well as what efforts we're taking to expand opportunities for all contractors to expand the workforce. Beyond that, we're continuing to try different strategies to get that work done faster as well as at a lower cost. But candidly, we're struggling, much like some other states are, to meet their settlement requirements as well. I can follow up with better numbers. Apologies for not having those in front of me today, but happy to follow up with the commission in totality with a better report on numbers and where we're at status.
Thank you, Mac. Yeah, and I know I blindsided you a bit with this question, so apologies for doing that. But I would like a report at our next meeting that gives us that status with a little bit more detail. I know I just said I wanted a global answer, which you kind of provided, but now I want more. Because I do think it's important to understand the level of investment over what period of time, because it's a big number. I mean, it's almost a quarter of the flexible funds. And I'm not objecting to complying with the settlement agreement. I'm just wanting to understand it from a financial standpoint. What we're engaged in here and the duration of it and the likely additional investment. And it can be a range if you want, but just, and maybe I'm the only one on the commission that is having this issue, but it comes up and we act, and then I feel like I don't know kind of where we are. Are we in the first third of this? Are we halfway through? Where are we?
Yeah, Chair, if I may, we do have an annual report that we're working to complete right now. That's part of the settlement agreement, as well as the required accessibility consultant. The independent accessibility consultant is producing their report 30 or 60 days later. So yeah, we're well positioned, I think, in that May timeframe to provide a comprehensive review based on ongoing conversations with the folks that were party to that settlement agreement as well.
Great. And I do know, because I saw it in my own neighborhood, that you can complete work on a given corner, and then there's an assessment of whether you've met the standards, which are quite exact. And we actually had this happen across the street from us, that to tear out and start over. So I realized that there's a challenge here given the level of the standard that has to be met. It's a high standard, and we're learning how to do it, and more specifically, our contractors are learning how to do it, outside contractors. So, and what they may think is close enough, apparently, upon review by the parties involved, is not. So I'd also like a little narrative on that, because I realize these are not always one and done. They're sometimes repaired and then have to be re-repaired. Okay. Any other questions on this list of the consensus hybrid flexible fund allocation proposal?
I just had one other follow-up to the ADA.
Yeah.
And I don't know if Mac or Travis, Coop, I see your hands up too. But I don't know whether or not if you guys can answer it at this meeting or not, but what would have happened if the IIJA funds didn't come in?
So I see Cooper's hand up.
Understanding to this, because it is a massive number. And if that money did not come in, what was your guys' contingency plan anyway without these resources?
So Cooper, do you want to take that question, or do you have a comment and then want Mac to take that question?
Well, it's a hard question, Mr. Chair, so I'll give it to Mac. And I'm joking. Chairman Rockland, Vice Chair Simpson, Cooper Brown, Assistant Director for Operations for ODOT. I'll be happy to take the question. If Mac or Travis want to add anything, certainly look to them to do so. It's a fair question, Vice Chair Simpson. I think we were looking internally at a number of funding sources to get us to in particular that first milestone that Mac mentioned of ensuring that we have the 7,700 ramps completed by the end of the year. And so it was a nice surprise to have these funds as a potential option to help fill that gap, because to Mac's point, and some of the challenge and why we haven't brought you a more kind of comprehensive number is that as we do more of these ramps, we get a better and more refined understanding of how much the cost is going to be. And to your comments, Chair Van Brockland, we also get a better and more refined understanding of how many we're going to have to redo. And all of those, enter into the overall calculation. And so because of that, we've had a more kind of ad hoc approach with how we're estimating the overall cost of the program. The comment I was going to make was a little bit along the lines of your question, Vice Chair Simpson. The $100 million that we put in here was really with an eye towards ensuring that we have the funds to get us through that first milestone at the end of the year. And as Mac mentioned, that's 30% of the overall program. I think realistically, if the commission decides to put in 100 more to the ADA program, that will help us get into that other 70% for the next decade that we've committed to and we'll be delivering. But it's certainly, to your question, Chair Van Brockland, not going to fill the entire need. We're talking hundreds of millions of dollars more that we would be putting into this program in order to deliver all 27,000 ramps that Mac mentioned. So to your kind of initial question, Chair Van Brockland, and we're happy to come back and give you fuller details on the specific numbers and our best estimates at the next meeting. But this is really to get us to that 30 to a little bit more percent of delivery. And then we're talking another few hundred million, I would say at the least, is a pretty fair assumption at this point to get us all the way to the 27,000, depending on cost of materials. And again, depending on refinement of how many ramps we have to replace as well. And how effective our cost efficiencies and savings, you'll recall, that's been a big part of the calculations as well. How do we do things differently in terms of right-of-way usage and requirements and other factors that have financial impacts to the program? Those are all, we're feeling our way through all of that as well and putting those into a calculation. So we'll be glad to come back and give you our best numbers. But I just wanted to plug that it's going to be significantly more, to your question, Chair Van Brockland.
Well, I appreciate that. I appreciate the comments. And I look forward to the report in May. and realize that, again, you know, if you need to use ranges, use ranges. But this is just what I'm becoming increasingly preoccupied with is not just the number of projects, large projects we have, but the amount. Because it seems like every time I turn around, I'm talking about another $500 million somewhere. And, you know, it's one thing if it's 25 million, if it's 500, it's just a completely different scale. And we have a lot of that ahead of us. And you guys know the list, so I won't go into that, but you know better than I do probably. But okay, any other questions of staff? And then maybe we'll move into our deliberation and decision on the proposal. Okay, thank you to all of you on the panel. And if we, you know, stick close, we may need to call upon you before we're done with our deliberation. So with that, I'll open it for comment on the proposal before us. Can we put that back up just so we can see it? In case someone wants to reference it. I think that was slide 11. Sabrina, can you put that? Thank you. Thank you. Okay. I'm looking for hands.
I'll just fire first, just to kind of break some ice here. I think I'm gonna go straight at the IMP, and I would feel more comfortable if that was in the ballpark of 10. I don't know what that looks like, and I know there's another pot of money that that staff is looking at to kind of marry up with that. And I know as Karen had talked about, this is a lot of the challenges that goes into reporting with federal dollars.
Yeah.
But again, it's just part of the process. You want the resources, it comes with work. And I think that's okay. People have to work for what they want or what they need. And so personally, I mean, it's like the two areas that are like areas that I would intimately have a lot of like personal sentiment about, like, are under double figures. And
Yeah.
adding them together, they're still the smallest. So it's like, okay, well, what are we saying here? So personally, I would like to see it. I'm not asking for over 10, but I think it definitely has to like at least be a 10.
And you're not saying it has to be 10 from the flexible funds. You're just looking for 10 total. Is that right? Or do you want it from this?
I just think 10 total. I mean, and that's why I asked the question about ADA, because it's like we just throw these numbers and it's like, okay, great, now go figure it. But it's just like, well, are we going to be in any more trouble if it's 95 versus 100? Are we going to get, 5 more ramps done a week faster than we're supposed to with it being 95? I don't know. So those are the things that like I think about personally when it comes to that kind of stuff, especially when you have massive numbers like that.
So I guess I'd ask Travis and Karen to come back on and talk about how we get that number to 10. I do know that state funding is often more flexible. There are more strings attached to federal funds, just as a general matter, and therefore sometimes a mix of federal and state funds is a better outcome than all federal. But if the best answer here is to take it to 10 from the flexible funding, federal flexible funding, then we'll find it in here, whether it's from ADA or somewhere else.
The other piece, I think, when I was also sharing, and sorry to jump in, Travis, on you, but about like community-based organizations, I know it would be a real kind of long, like complex conversation if we're talking about small businesses utilizing the resources too, because I think they are an important instrument to transitioning into a more just alternative, climate conscious, non-combustion engine transportation system of the future. But if you have public agencies which have been identified and talked about and discussed, they have plenty of resources when it comes to reporting to the federal government. And so I just wanted to say that for the record.
Certainly, Chair Van Brocklen, I will speak to the funding amounts and leave, Karen can address any substantive issues. The total funding for the Innovative Mobility Pilot would be set at $10 million under this proposal, $5 million from federal funds and $5 million from the Transportation Operating Fund is our most likely source there. And we do view that as sort of a core base foundational program to which we might add other funds. So for example, while this could cover a portion of the needs for tolling mitigation, we might find other funds that are available from tolling or other fund colors that could be used to supplement this. So really it is up to the commission if you would like to add additional funding to bump up the total federal funds, from 5 to 10, bump up the total in the Innovative Mobility Program, from 10 to 15 or even 20. Certainly that is something that we could do, and it would give us perhaps a slightly different flavor of program when we bring that back to you in May for your approval.
Yeah, the only thing that I would add is that part of what our next steps in our job will be is in talking with the communities and figuring out in a bit more detail about the project types and who's interested. That will help us to identify the best color of money to point at those projects and those potential recipients to try to make it as easy as possible to get those projects going. So that's part of what we would be looking to do. Right now, there's because it is focused on innovation, there's some things that we already know would be best suited for either state or federal funds, and there's other things that we probably haven't even thought of yet that we'd have to figure out the best way to accomplish it.
I mean, maybe the most constructive, just a friendly suggestion, maybe the most constructive thing to do is to set a minimum number here and have them come back with a mix. It might be, so if our minimum number is 10, then we would want to see in May what that looks like and where the funds are, or 15. So
Chair Van Brocklen, we could certainly do that and would take your direction on that. One thing I will note that we're still working out a little bit is the Innovative Mobility Pilot Program and our electric vehicle charging supplemental funds are both coming from the same source. And so we need to make sure that we have capacity in that transportation operating fund in order to meet both needs at whatever level the commission provides direction. And so that would be something we could bring back to you in May, but certainly would take your direction on what level of funding and what fund sources we should be exploring, how much federal versus how much state.
And what's your comment, Travis, on flexibility? Is my supposition about flexibility of state funding generally is better than federal?
Mr. Chair, I would absolutely agree with that. I mean, I will tell you that most of our grantees, where we offer it, will swap out their federal dollars for state dollars. We offer that on many of our highway projects because the federal highway funding requires you to meet federal design requirements. It requires you to follow federal permitting requirements, NEPA, federal procurement standards. And so in the case of the Innovative Mobility Pilot, I think we would have both the reporting requirements as well as federal procurement standards that oftentimes are very challenging for, even for some local governments to meet. And certainly for some smaller based community-based organizations who are perhaps not as familiar with meeting those requirements. So yes, that's the thought about going to the Transportation Operating Fund is we have a little bit more flexibility there in terms of what reporting requirements and the procurement and some of those other details, just a fewer strings attached.
So Commissioner Simpson, what do you think?
I mean, that is a good point. because that was something I highlighted when we started this process. So I appreciate that, Travis. Just the red tape can be daunting. I just don't want to vote on something and it's locked in. That's my only concern.
So if we set a number, you said 10. Is that still your number, or do you want to?
Well, the question is what he just highlighted the transportation operating fund.
Yep.
Yeah, great. If it's 5 there and it's 15 from this other fund that has less red tape and less barriers and less hurdles and less cumbersome processes, sure. But I don't know what that number is. We haven't discussed that number with the other side. And so, not the other side, but as it compares to this, to what would actually be that kind of range for the actual pilot. Because if I'm sitting on this, watching this from the public, I'm like, oh, $5 million, like, great. What are you going to do with that? Like, look at these massive numbers, right? So that's something that I think we should probably map out.
So what would you think about, bring back a plan for a program not smaller than 10 and not larger than 20, and then they could, or if you want different numbers, suggest them, and then have them come back with the best mix of funds for kind of to meet the program's initial objectives. It seems like we should give them direction on the total number and let them come back to us with the mix.
I know Director Strickler has his hand up, so I don't know if there's something he wants to inject on right now.
Director?
How about I just call the hand raising? Because I'm seeing it.
Yeah, I don't know what it is with me. I'm seeing him now that you mention it. I was looking at you. I tend to concentrate on the person who's talking instead of these little hands. Yeah, I learned that early. Director Strickler?
Yeah, thank you. Mr. Chair, members of the commission, for the record, Chris Strickler, Director of ODOT. Part of what I'm hearing is how do we get to the right number, and then what is the fund source that number comes from? I'll look to Travis, so Travis, stay on camera so that you can glare at me or not otherwise if I get this wrong. But I think I'm hearing a little bit of how do we increase the number to make it a worthwhile program, but not hamper the program if in fact there are federal requirements that become cumbersome in the future in a way that doesn't allow us to move forward with what the stated objectives are. And so what I might suggest, just as a point of consideration for the dialogue, is if I'm hearing 5 is not enough and we should increase here to 10, Mr. Chair, somewhat along your lines of no less than 10, no more than 20, it might make sense to simply consider approving 10 out of these funds. We match the 10 out of some other state fund to show a $20 million program. And then if at some point in the future, say the May meeting or even a meeting after that, if we find that that's becoming too cumbersome, we could certainly come back and ask the commission's approval and comfort in adjusting some of that without adjusting the overall number. So a little bit to your point of agreeing to the overall number, but giving us something to shoot at as a starting point for how much to take out of these funds to begin with.
Mr. Chair, I would agree with Mr. Strickler. He took the words out of my mouth that, today, if you approve these numbers, then it becomes harder to go back and add in $5 million in federal funding. So I would recommend that if you'd like to increase the number, perhaps move it from 5 to 10 or whatever the number is, with accompanying direction to ODOT to go look for a similar number of state funds. I think we would be able to get to, say, a $10 million federal matched by $10 million state, but we'd need to come back and report because we need to go look at how much have we committed for electric vehicles, how much we'd be committing on this side, and does the fund overall have capacity? This is also the fund that funds senior and disabled transportation, the Amtrak Cascade trains, some work for community paths, some other things like that. So we need to make sure that we have the capacity. But I think if you gave us that direction today to increase federal funds and complement it with a similar amount of state, I think we could come back with a pretty good proposal, and I think we'd be okay.
Okay, that sounds like a good approach to me. Lando, what do you think?
Me too, but I would rather open it up for everybody else to have feedback, because I'm just one of.
Sure, of course. No, that's next, but I wanted to get your thoughts first since you brought this forward.
Yeah, I think that's a respectful gesture personally. And I appreciate you, Director Strickler, for jumping in.
So other members of the commission, Commissioner Brown, I see your hand up.
So thank you, Chair, and thank you, Travis and Chris, for jumping in. My biggest concern is that we don't start taking away from other funding sources because the pots are so small. So when we're looking at other dollars and if they are state dollars or whatever we're doing, so when you started talking about passenger rail and some of these others, you don't want to start taking away to where we can no longer provide good service. And so for me, I'd rather we take some federal funds and move them. And I know that I've been one of the people that have one of the commissioners that have pushed for the fix-it to be increased, but taken maybe 5 million from the fix-it and decreasing it just a little bit to give that, to bring it to 10, and then we can go from there, or 15, go from there. But I get concerned when I start hearing about taking from other funds, elderly and disabled, et cetera. It starts giving me a little bit of heartburn because we've done that for years. You know, what we're trying to do is lift the transportation system. And when we start pilfering from other programs, we're not accomplishing what we're trying to do. And that's just my thoughts. I'll stand down.
Commissioner Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I agree with Orlando that we should see maybe this increase to $10 million out of this fund. I also am I think it's important to have some flexibility in the funds, state funds. While I'm definitely mindful of Commissioner Brown's concern about taking from other programs, I think I'd be comfortable with staff looking at what really are the alternatives. How can they get another 10 million without really hurting other programs, and then have a report back on that. And as far as like changing some of the numbers here to get to 10 for the innovative mobility pilot, I'm almost inclined to take 5 million from the ADA because it's such a big number, and I know it's only a portion of what we need. But if I understood the comments correctly, this is going to get us beyond this year for future years. And as the years go by, we may be able to find some other funds to supplement it. So rather than take it from Fix It, that's just my first impression. I don't have real strong feelings about that, but that's just a suggestion. Back to you, Mr. Chair.
Commissioner Burke.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to go to the top of this slide with consensus hybrid flexible fund and reiterate my concern that this option looks a lot like peanut butter. It's very similar to the balanced. I mean, there are some differences to the balanced scenario, and I appreciate that, we will have an impact with this level of funding in each of these areas. And so again, as we start to say, oh, well, let's take 5 from here, 5 from there, I'm concerned about what does that mean in terms of if we take 5 or 10 million from Fix It, what are we losing in what we thought needed to be done in Fix It? Just as if we looked at something that wasn't another fund that's not this flexible funding. So our review is necessarily at an incredibly high level here. And so in some ways, these some of these decisions can feel, what's the right word? That we are making choices. Let's just say that I don't necessarily feel comfortable with. Let's just put it that way. So I just want to express that as a general concern. Of course, all of these areas are worthy. Right? It's not actually a debate, right? And again, our job is to prioritize the funding here. And so I just concerned that we keep trending towards peanut butter. As much as I like peanut butter, don't want anyone who grows peanuts or makes peanuts to be upset with me, that this is not necessarily the way that I think we should be budgeting.
All good comments. I'm wondering how people would feel about moving 5 million from ADA. And I realize there are concerns there as well, off of Commissioner Burke's position. But if we did that and put that at 10 and then charge the agency to look at additional funding up to 20 million, recognizing they're gonna have to look at the impact of other things. Commissioner Smith? So I guess I just put that out there as an idea. I'd love to get some feedback on.
I was just gonna maybe make a comment on the peanut butter analogy, which I totally get. Acknowledging that we have so many needs and not enough money. And a little bit of a levity is sometimes when you don't have enough money to buy groceries, peanut butter is a good option. So
yes, true.
And I'm flexible on the $5 million from the ADA. I think we can probably figure that out going forward. But I don't have strong.
Mr. Brown?
Well, and I'm going to agree with everybody said. I mean, we are spreading this, and this is the problem. We did this with the Fix It early on when we were reallocating money in the STIP, and that's why we're pushing to put money back into the Fix It. I mean, this is just impossible sometimes. But I do agree with Commissioner Simpson that it's not enough money moving forward. And so I would look to staff to figure this out for us, because they have better control of the budget as far as understanding the different colors of money and what they can be used for. But I threw the Fix It out there because the cut was bigger and we got back quite a bit. And so that's why I threw that one out there. I don't care where it comes from. But we don't want to spread it to the point where we just can't do what we need to do.
So I like the comment about get an informed proposal here to take it up from 5 million. So now I'm thinking we should look at this allocation, removing the innovative mobility pilot for a month until our May meeting, or else approve it at 5 with direction to figure out where to go above 5, because the rest of it may be better, frankly, if it's state money. So I guess the threshold question here is, do you want to move some money on this list to innovative mobility pilot? Let's just get an answer to that question. How many people want to move some money from somewhere else? Let's not identify where yet. Let's just take this one question at a time. How many people want to raise your hand in the little hand thing? Now I'm going to use this as a organizing principle. Vote by hand, and I'll mention who's voting for this. So far I see 3: Simpson, Smith, and Brown. Okay, so we're going to move we're going to move some money around in here. Majority want to do that. So would someone make a proposal?
I was going to just inject real quick, Chair, and I think it's already been brought to the table twice that we consider looking at ADA. Even in all due respect to Commissioner Burke's point about peanut butter, which, man, I love almond butter, by the way, but peanut butter is good too. But I think, to be honest, what we're doing right now, Commissioner Burke, is what people have been asking us to do for years. This agency has been deemed a rubber stamp, or the commission has been deemed a rubber stamp commission. And I really do believe that these public deliberations and peanut butter spreading practices that we're engaging in right now is actually necessary. Because otherwise, there's not a lot of point for us to be here to do this. I mean, we could be doing this with dollars, we can be doing this with policy work. But I think this is the appropriate gesture for us as appointed officials for this state agency that has such a massive budget. Because there's a lot of things people don't get a lot of insight into. And I think this shows the ability for us to work collectively together, which is an art lost, or a lost art in today's society, in terms of working on what it is we think is in the best interest for the state as it pertains to transportation. So I just wanted to say that, and not to like discredit, because I'm not a big fan of the whole exercise of peanut butter spreading, but I think these public conversations and these formats are what we need to do nowadays in these public settings.
So is there, thank you, Commissioner Simpson, is there a proposal for, I think I heard ADA from 3 commissioners, myself, Commissioner Smith, Commissioner Simpson. So is there, Commissioner Burke? I think you have a comment first.
I do. So one is, I have a question and a comment. So I understand this perception or reality of whether or not the commission has formally in the past rubber stamped things that were brought to it by the staff. I think we've looked at a number of options. And so it is not that we have not been a deliberative, thoughtful body to this point. And so it's not a matter that this somehow is symbolic, this consensus of us doing something different, to my mind. There are lots of different options before us on the table, and we've had very good discussions about it. So I just would characterize what we're doing as a little bit differently than the vice chair. But if I could get, again, before we move to someone proposing that the 5 million comes from ADA, if I could get a quick recap from the staff about what impact they think that will have on our ability to do what we have a legal obligation to do.
Fair question. So let's hear, who wants to take that? The director, the assistant director, Mac? Who wants to take that question?
I'd be happy to tell you a little bit from a financial perspective, and then Mr.
Okay.
Linder or Mr. Strickler could fill that in. So what we would see from a financial perspective is you will have to come back and provide more ADA funding in the future. So moving $5 million out of ADA funding would mean in the future, you're going to need to go find $5 million more in ADA funding. So in that sense, it in some ways kicks the can down the road a little bit. It's an entirely reasonable response, and yet it doesn't really get us out of our long-term challenge, as it means that the next tranche of ADA funding will have to be $5 million more.
Director Strickler.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, members of the commission, I was going to say something very similar to what Mr. Brower just stated. Either way, we have to come back to the commission because that can is definitively waiting for us to kick it a little further down the road. And so we do have to come back. It will change the number. I will also admit that we need to bring a little more finality to what those numbers are as it relates to schedule, what our progress is, completion, et cetera, in order to be able to refine the numbers. So the difference between 95 and 100, while significant in what we're able to accomplish, because every ramp that isn't done is significant for a community that's waiting for it, it is not substantively significant on the asks that are going to come before the commission in the future, because we have another one coming.
Chris, let me ask you a question. If you were going to rejigger this list and put 5 million more federal money, which is what I heard the majority wanted, into the innovative mobility pilot, what would you propose?
Certainly, Mr. Chair and members of the commission, the factors that are not readily on the screen that you're all wrestling with at the same time is that not every dollar spends the same and buys the same in each of these categories. And so they're all, tied to a time frame, they're all tied to an implementation, they're all tied to the types of construction or activity associated with it. So for example, local climate planning is a brain power acquisition, right? That's agencies and jurisdictions working towards planning efforts, which is significant and important going forward, and yet doesn't quite cost as much as something in the enhanced category, for example, which is more direct construction, right? And so because all of those have different buying power, as I look at this list and as I contemplate that with what I've heard from the commission through conversations over the last 4 months on these issues, I would probably go towards the ADA category as well, only because we know we have to come back and have more conversation there. And while we have to come back and have more conversation in some of the other categories as well, it's probably the one where we need to bring some of more clarity to what our future construction schedules could be and what the future construction amounts could be. There is nothing magical about the 100 million that would get us a perfect milestone moment. It is simply, we know we have a significant need and we want to continue to put that need in front of the commission as we know more about what the overall need is going to be. So I would suggest there, again, based upon what I've heard from the commission dialogue. And I'll also say, in a perfect world, we would have a long list of the identified projects that are funded and unfunded. And while we have many of those, we don't yet. And I think in that vein, it leads us towards what Commissioner Burke has described as the peanut butter approach. I will tell you, I would much rather be working this in the other way, which is we know the project list and we've got to find that cut line. Timing of the funding and the expiration date on the funding going elsewhere probably prohibits our ability with this round of doing that, but I certainly understand that approach because, again, all of these different categories, you achieve more or less depending upon the dollar value contributed. So that is my long-winded soapbox of I believe the ADA is probably the appropriate place.
Mr. Burke, do you have follow-up on that?
I do not. Thank you.
Okay. So I think we've got, well, someone needs to move the 5 million if there is an interest in doing that. So I'll look to the commissioners for a motion. Commissioner Smith.
I move that we move $5 million from the ADA to the Innovative Mobility Pilot Program with the request that staff come back with another funding mechanism for up to an additional $10 million for future consideration.
Is there a second?
I'll second, Chair.
Commissioner Simpson seconds. Is there further discussion? Okay, I'll call the roll. Commissioner Brown?
Aye.
Commissioner Simpson? I didn't. Commissioner Simpson?
Aye.
Oh, sorry. Commissioner Burke?
Aye.
Commissioner Smith?
Aye.
Chair votes aye. Okay. So this chart now reads at the Innovative Mobility Pilot, 10 million with follow-up on additional funding of up to 20 million total. So 10 million in the Innovative Mobility Pilot and 95 million in the ADA line. So with that discussion concluded, are there other areas on this list people want to ask questions or make comments? Commissioner Smith.
I move approval of the revised list.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Vice Chair seconds. Discussion? I would just say that my understanding is that with respect to, and we're going to hear from Mr. Lind in a second, but with respect to two categories that are not on the flexible side, we're going to be hearing more about in May. And those two categories are an update on the specifics on the 100 million for EV charging and related investments in the EV infrastructure and in bridges. And we'll hear about bridges a little bit in just a second. So my comment is those are coming, as well as the innovative mobility pilot proposal on additional funding above the 10 million up to 20 million. So those three things we'll hear further about in the May meeting. Any other discussion points? Okay, hearing none, I will call the roll on Commissioner Smith's motion, seconded by Vice Chair Simpson. All those in favor, Commissioner Smith. Commissioner Smith votes aye. Commissioner Burke.
Aye.
Commissioner Simpson. Commissioner Smith votes aye. Commissioner Brown.
Aye.
Commissioner Brown votes aye. Chair votes aye. Okay, thank you all very much. We will now move to item 2A2, bridge funding. Mr. Lind.
Yeah, good afternoon. Once again, Chair Van Brocklin, members of the Commission, Macklin, Interim Administrator for Delivery Operations. We briefed this previously, I think at the February meeting at a high level, just the influx of additional bridge funding that the IIJA brought to Oregon. One-time funding and a special appropriations allocation of $268 million. We've mentioned that at a high level, but today we're going to talk a little bit more about what our proposed strategy for sharing those funds between ODOT bridges and city and county bridges. We're not asking you to make that decision today, but using this opportunity to daylight our proposal, one that we've been working with the League of Oregon Cities and Association of Oregon Counties. And then, as you alluded to, Chair Van Brocklin, we're bringing back the formal proposal in May for consideration and approval. Next slide, please. So all bridges certainly are important to someone, but all bridges aren't the same. Some bridges are quite large, especially when you think about some of the interstate bridges or the bridges along the coast that are crossing those significant river corridors, as well as local bridges. And previously I shared this picture. Here's an example of a Linn County bridge, something that we would call an off-system bridge, meaning off the federal highway system, something that serves the local community in a very needed way. So when we look at almost 7,000 bridges in the state, 7,000 publicly accessible or usable bridges in the state, much like your conversation you all were just working through, how do we make a decision on how best to allocate those funds, given the needs of bridges, not only on the state ODOT facilities, but also on city and county facilities. And that's a big part of our work that we've been doing, and one that we wanted to share with the commission today before we ask for your approval in May. Next slide, please. I shared this previously. I've got two slides I want to walk through just around ODOT bridge condition and local agency bridge condition. And bear with me, I'm sharing a little bit of data here as I build up towards the criterion approach that we've been working on and how to assess the needs to ultimately allocate the funds. So I previously talked about ODOT's bridges in the past. If you'll notice, while we're reducing the number of poor bridges over the last 10 years, the growing concern is how many bridges are in those poor or fair categories, and more in those fair categories. We actually split it in two. just in the way we rate our bridges and the intense data management that we have. We inspect every bridge every year. Just our approach has a rating system, a national rating system that we apply to all bridges in the state, both ODOT and local agencies. So the concern is we have more bridges moving out of that good category in the bottom, moving into that fair category and inching closer towards poor. So we've been making that decision on how are we going to fund improvements to preserve those bridges, to make them last longer. But you've heard me and others say this, our bridge replacement cycle for ODOT bridges about every 900 years. We replace about 3 per year typically, and the infusion of any amount of IIJA funds will certainly help, but it doesn't dramatically change that number. Next slide, please. So ODOT bridges, we have about 2,700 bridges. When we pivot over to the local agencies, cities and counties, there's about 4,000 bridges on the city and county infrastructure system. And you can see those bridges are in a little better condition from a just count by count number of the bridges and what condition are they in. A few more bridges in the good category, a few more maybe than ODOT in the poor category, but they have essentially the same concern or challenge with a lot of bridges in those fair categories. So we're still managing an aging infrastructure and an aging asset. I think that's it on that side. So I think it's a unique position we find ourselves in, much like some other aspects of our transportation system. ODOT's role in inspecting and inventorying the bridges is for all bridges of the state, all publicly accessible bridges. So we have a pretty long history of working with local agencies on how best to allocate those funds. And I think much to your deliberations earlier, if we put 10 bridge engineers from ODOT and cities and counties all in a room, there'd be 10 different opinions on how to assess this. But I think building from that partnership and approach over the years, we've been working on how do we manage the needs of the ODOT system as well as the needs of the city and county systems. Next slide, please. The other way that we look at it is not just purely a number of bridges, not just a count by count perspective, but deck area. So how big are these bridges? That's the best proxy we have for the size and complexity of the bridges and how much traffic or users do they serve. It's a little bit of a proxy for that. I'd probably draw your attention to the far left in this diagram. You can see the percentage of deck area that is the state-owned system. So if you look at just bridge area across the state has about 70% of the bridge deck area across the state. When you think about that, it's probably easiest to think about some of the big bridges on the interstate, obviously a lot of surface area compared to that bridge I had on the screen to start, much smaller bridge serving a much smaller community, but equally as important. We've tried to parse out, how do we look at this bridge area perspective or deck area perspective in that good, fair, poor situation as a bit of a proxy for how do we balance the need, not only from a count by count perspective of the bridges, but what are they serving? Next slide, please. So all of that's a bit of lead up to our work with local agencies and the additional infusion of funding. What criteria were we using to approach this work? So a couple of key things. I mentioned a few of these already. ODOT bridges typically carry a higher traffic volume. They're typically larger. I think the exception to that is some of the large bridges in the Portland metro area, mainly managed by Multnomah County. The local agency bridge selection committee I'll speak to a little bit more has had a long history of they wrestle with big county bridges as well as small county bridges as well. So as they're allocating these funds on a project by project basis. We also have the National Highway System standards from FHWA. So federal law requires us to manage our performance measure of National Highway System, which includes both ODOT bridges as well as some major city and county bridges as well. So it's a performance measure that's driving how we're looking at this. And then, of course, a big component of this in managing our aging infrastructure is how are we working to preserve bridges and not just spending money to replace them, but what are we doing to extend their useful life? I've mentioned previously the Fremont Bridge in Portland is a great example. We're likely going to use some of the IIJA funding to help paint that steel structure to continue to preserve the longevity of that structure. Next slide, please. So getting down to the numbers. I don't want to bore you with the numbers, but I think they're instructive to how all of that is leading to what does the dollars and cents come out like. A very big component of the IIJA legislation is 15% of the funding has to go to off-system bridges. There's a little less than 200 off-system bridges across the state. Almost entirely, and almost all of them, are on the local system. I think ODOT has one bridge on an off-system. So we know we're going to have to dedicate a significant amount of funding, about $40 million, towards those off-system bridges. They're in pretty poor condition. And that's, I think, an important point. While we have about 200, other states have far more. So that's a little bit of the challenge of how the federal legislation was passed. And we have a long history of having pretty good success in managing those off-system bridges and I think funding them based on the need, as well as continuing to keep their condition at a relative perspective compared to the users of the other bridges. So maybe said another way, if it's only serving 1 or 2 homes, is that a higher priority than some of the other bridges on the local system? And that's not a decision for us, ODOT, to make. That's really the cities and counties to make that decision. So when we look at the table of funding, the first thing I will point out on the ODOT side, you see how big our pre-IIJA funding was. I want to really emphasize, why is that number so large? It's a direct effect of House Bill 2017. So the state passed funding program of 2017 that dedicated state highway dollars out of the ODOT share to bridges. We have not been investing federal dollars into bridges because of House Bill 2017. That is just such a huge infusion of cash in a dedicated manner. The local agency side of this chart does not have an infusion of House Bill 2017 funds for their bridges. That's I think a very distinct point to raise in this conversation. As we work through the criteria that I've described earlier, you can see how it comes out. So there's a significant increase to both local bridges and ODOT bridges in our recommendation. You can see the percentage increase overall, as well as how much of the additional IIJA funds will be shared with local agencies and with ODOT in this proposal. Next slide, please. This is probably a prettier way to view this. The good news is everyone who owns bridges sees a little benefit, but as you can tell, we really wrestled with our partners at League of Oregon Cities and Association of Oregon Counties on how to approach this based from a need perspective, not just from a we're going to calculate the numbers like we always have and come out with the answer. We really took a step back and looked at the need. But as I said at the beginning, you get 10 people in a room, there's 10 different opinions. We feel comfortable and confident in this approach and working with our partners at cities and counties. But wanted to bring this to you today as a recommendation, and we'll bring it to you in May for final consideration and approval. Last comment I will make on this. So what goes on after the decision is made? There's a long-standing committee, the Local Agency Bridge Selection Committee. It's made of representatives from cities, counties, and ODOT bridge engineers that will make the decision on which bridges will be allocated funds. So much like we've talked about, these dollars will be infused into existing ODOT programs and allow us to, go deeper on the list of projects to fund. That Bridge Selection Committee will be doing much the same. They've had applications in, so they're in the process of evaluating those projects. And I think it's important to note, we ODOT do not hold the final decision on that. That is a collaborative committee of those representatives around the table. So So that concludes my presentation today to daylight the approach that we've been working on with our partners, and one we will bring back to you in May for consideration.
Thank you very much. Are there questions for Mr. Lind, Commissioner Smith?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to make sure I understand the direction in the IIJA funding. They allocated a certain amount for bridges. And what were the other kind of bookends of how to spend them? Did they have, is it like we could choose to use it all for our state bridges, or is there any kind of direction in the legislation?
Chair Van Brockton, Commissioner Smith, appreciate that question. The first and foremost is that off-system bridge requirement that 15% of the funds have to be spent on those off-system bridges. Beyond that, it's really guidance on how to approach the prioritization of those funds based on the National Bridge Inventory, the data around the condition of bridges, but the feds really give us a lot of flexibility and how best to allocate and direct those funds. There is not a percentage that says you shall follow this methodology to distribute the funds between city and county and state-owned facilities. We really leave that to the state to make that decision. And we certainly have a long-standing history of doing that partnership. What we've heard from some other states is they just rolled with their normal percentage and didn't really talk about it. I'm not sure that's the right approach here. And then I will mention some states have just a very different makeup of their bridges, a lot more local agency bridges in maybe a far worse condition. And the off-system bridge piece is a much bigger discussion in several of the Midwest states are the places that I hear about it the most. So to answer your question more explicitly, there's a lot of guidance. There's a lot of ways to look at it. Then the number one aspect is we have to allocate 15% of the funds to those off-system bridges.
Great, thank you.
Other questions for Mr. Lind? Okay, thank you very much. Just let me summarize where I think we are. We have passed the flexible funding allocation with the amendment involving the innovative mobility to 10 million, the direction to come back in May with a proposal on other funds to bring that program up to as much as 20 million. So that is done. What's ahead in May, as I understand it, are potential action on the innovative mobility, additional funding. The proposal that we have just heard on the bridge allocation coming back to us for a decision. So that would be a second decision. And the EV charging at at least 100 million for the coming years on EV charging. So those are all actions. And the reason I want to summarize those is I want to confirm that that is the timing on those three, as I understand it. And therefore, we need to get some kind of a posting up at some point between now and May, so people have an opportunity, the public has an opportunity to comment on these proposals. I think we have to have some kind of, we're going to have public comment at our May meeting, but I think we have to have notice of what we want people to comment on. So on those three, this is a question, but if we have those actions coming up, it seems to me we need to have some predicate to that in terms of something posted on the webpage, maybe as we put up the May agenda that allows people to provide written comment and then be on notice so they could appear for or sign up for oral comment if they want to talk about any of these things. Those are the three that I show as actions. The updates would be the ADA update that we talked about, where are we? And I believe at the beginning, Travis, you talked about a grant funds presentation, because the good news in all of this, I think, is obviously the money we have, but it's also the potential $100 billion discretionary grant program sitting with the Secretary of Transportation for us to, and by us, I mean not just the state, but localities to apply for additional funding. I mean, that could be a substantial amount of additional funding into the state. So those would be updates. So, but I am worried before we take action that we make sure we've given the public an opportunity to comment on the innovative mobility, bridges, and the EV charging. So Travis, I guess I turn to you to make sure that we're doing what we need to do now, and anything we need to say before we adjourn now, and then anything we need to be doing ahead of the meeting in May to ensure that the public has notice and opportunity to comment on these subjects.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, members of the commission, you are correct in your approach here, and that is the plan. Is to you have now, I think, made it very clear that we will be bringing these back for public comment and for approval. I would say that the two things for certain that we will be bringing back in May are the bridge funding allocation. And now that you've given us a dollar figure for Innovative Mobility Pilot Program, we'll bring that outline back in May. Amanda unfortunately had to leave to go to a presentation. I believe we're actually thinking about bringing the electric vehicle charging back at a later date when we're bringing back the carbon reduction program for a policy discussion. But it is absolutely on the list of likely or of upcoming conversations per that last bullet about various programs where we're going through the development process. And so the carbon reduction program, that would be an area to fund supplemental EV work, is one that we were slated to bring to you this summer, most likely, as we bring to you the thoughts about how would we structure that program, how would we bring stakeholders around the table, what are the policy decisions you'd make up front to provide direction versus those that you would give to the advisory committee and ask them for their direction. We will also in May be bringing you STIP amendments. There are projects that are raring to go that need to actually be amended into the STIP so that we can get them moving through either engineering or into construction. And then again in September, we would bring you the annual STIP update that would include a much larger number of projects once those are selected by ODOT and by the various groups that are working with local governments, like that local agency bridge selection committee that Mac referenced. The projects that are a little bit further out in the 24 to 27 STIP will actually be incorporated into that STIP that's under development today. So you'll see that in the future. And then, just to add on to that program development work, there will be various other programs that need to come in front of the commission, most likely for more in terms of feedback. I don't know that there will be specific, thumbs up, thumbs down approval actions, so much as an ongoing conversation about some of those things. But we will bring those to you as needed. And as you ask for any additional details, we will bring those forward. So again, as I noted earlier, you may want to be done with this IIJA work, but you have a little ways to go. And yet you really have made the most important decisions at this point about the allocation of the flexible funds.
Okay, thank you. So the only comment I would make on all of that is that, well, really two. One is as issues are coming up, that we make sure we're thinking about how we notice in order to get public comment. That's one. So that we're doing that in a timely way that allows the public to participate at our meetings in responding to proposals. The other thing is, we obviously, to state the blatantly obvious, we do not want to endanger any of this funding by not approving it in a timely manner. So if we're not going to hear about EV charging and carbon reduction in May, which is fine, let's just make sure we're hearing about it in a way that doesn't risk any of the funding that has been allocated to us. So, then in July, but I don't want to get, right up to the deadline and find out, oh, wait a minute, we forgot to do something. We're putting some amount of money that we have in at risk for being reallocated to other states. So this program ought to be designed so that we make sure we're making timely decisions that don't endanger the money.
Mr. Chair, that's a really important point. And one of the reasons why we had you gavel down on the flexible funds today is that is use it or lose it money that needs to be allocated. The bridge funding is actually available for 3 years, so we don't have quite the deadline on that. And then the reason why the carbon reduction program and the EV program will take a little bit longer is we're still waiting for some federal guidance. And more importantly, we have to put together plans that will need to be submitted before we can really unlock those funds. So they, as new programs, have a little bit more of a fuse on them that takes a little while to burn through. So you have taken the action on the urgent items, and now we have some of those items that will take a little bit longer to work through that require some additional work.
Great. So I know you're totally on top of all this, Travis, but I just needed to say that so it's on the record. Anything else for, I guess I'll look to Travis again since he's kind of emceeing this. Anything else that you need to bring before us today?
No, Mr. Chair, we have brought to you the work that needs to be done, and I appreciate the diligence of the commission over the last several months. You've had many, many conversations, many, many extra meetings, heard from literally thousands of Oregonians, and you have now completed the most important work on the infrastructure bill. So give yourself a pat on the back. I was looking for an applause button on Zoom when you finalize the flexible funding allocation. Unfortunately, does not work in the webinar version of this. But thank you very much for your diligence.
Thank you. Members of the commission, any other comments or questions or anything else you'd like to bring before the commission today? No? Okay. Then we stand adjourned. Thank you all very much.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
I'm calling you, Julie.